weeks on the Gospel of Matthew as a kind of help you get to know this Gospel better. In our narrative lectionary, we're going to be hearing from Matthew. We've been hearing the Gospel reading from Matthew for the most part all fall so far, but as you know, our primary text has been walking through the story of the Old Testament up to Christ. Well, we're of course close to Christmas now, and once that happens, we'll be hearing from Matthew all the way through Easter, and we're going to take his Gospel in progression. We won't be jumping around. We'll be moving along to get his kind of flow or his narrative in telling the story. So I want you to get to know Matthew better for that purpose, but also just because it's one of the four Gospels and it's an amazing Gospel. We did a lot of work last spring with the Gospel of John, and this year we're going to help you get to know Matthew better. So the goal is indeed to help you appreciate the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew's unique emphases and perspective, and really so you can get to know our Lord better, and certainly that your reading of Matthew will be enriched and enlivened. So that's the goal. Just for fun, I thought I'd put this little papyrus up here for you. This is called Papyrus 1. There's a whole bunch of papyri, manuscripts. And this is called Papyrus 1. It's a fragment about 8.5 inches by 7 inches. On one side, on one side it has verses 1 through 9 and 12. I think that's this side. And then on the other side it has 13, 14 through 20. So what that tells us is that at some point there existed a papyrus with the Gospel of Matthew on it, that on one side it had one part, and the other side it had another part. You'll note it's dated to the early 3rd century. That means it's like somewhere between 200 and 250 AD. So about 150 years or so after, probably 200 years after it was written. I recently talked to a young person whose faith journey was actually pretty radically altered by learning that the canon of the New Testament didn't float down in a parachute. And unfortunately, however, she was told that a bunch of old men in a smoke-filled room secretly came up with the books of the New Testament and suppressed and got rid of all these other books that tell a little bit different story about Jesus. And it was kind of a conspiracy. I've even heard of some people who say that the church invented Jesus in the 4th century or so, when Constantine became emperor and became a Christian. This is carbon dated. No one with any kind of logic or brain, would be able to say that this manuscript isn't from, 200 to 250 AD. So I put that up here just to show you that when it comes to the textual evidence for our Gospels and for our New Testament, there is no book in existence that has the testimony, the rigor of manuscript evidence for its existence and the authenticity of Christianity. Papyrus did not last long. That the Dead Sea Scrolls are in existence because they hid them away in caves, and the Dead Sea was a very dry, perfect kind of place to store a manuscript. But even those crumbled into tiny little pieces that scholars have had to put together like a jigsaw puzzle. So we wouldn't expect to have the originals of the New Testament, the first manuscript Matthew wrote, but we can get awful close. And it's exciting that here, when it comes to the Gospel of Matthew, we have this little papyrus that has a part of Matthew on it. So I always like to give you a little bit of the textual criticism or the textual analogy or background when I come at these Gospels, because it is a common narrative that I hear today. Go to Barnes & Noble, go into the religious section, and you'll see tons of books debunking the New Testament authenticity. And I just wish they could be more upfront that they have an axe to grind. Because whether you're a Christian or not, like I say, the New Testament has more textual evidence than any other book. If you're going to throw out the New Testament because of some of the logic, Plato didn't exist, Aristotle didn't exist, none of these people have any of the manuscript evidence that the New Testament has. So if you're going to play that game, I say go all the way. But anyway, I kind of went afield here. I didn't mean to get on a soapbox on that. So I really just love to look at papyrus, and maybe in my sabbatical I can go and take a look at some of these in Europe and other places. Anyway, that's an exciting thing. So I want to tell you my sources for the information I'm going to give you and help you to read Matthew. First of all, Dr. Mark Allen Powell has a wonderful introduction to the New Testament. I commend it to any of you who are really serious. You really want to have a book that you can go to. He has a summary of each book and great background. It's super. And then I'm also relying on Dr. Robert Smith, who's passed away now, but he was one of my New Testament professors at PLTS, and it's got a great commentary on Matthew. So, a little introduction, and maybe a little trivia. I'm just going to read this from Mark Allen Powell. Here's a fun piece of Bible trivia, he says. In Psalm 46, in the King James Version of the Bible, anybody got their King James with them today? I don't know. The 46th word from the beginning, not counting the Psalm superscription, is shakes. And the 46th word from the ending, not counting the Selah, the musical thing at the end, is spear. The King James Bible was completed in 1610, the year William Shakespeare celebrated his 46th birthday. Many literature scholars think that translators of this Bible, who were big fans of Bard's work, snuck a birthday tribute to Shakespeare into the Word of God itself. I read that to you because even though Matthew doesn't have some of those types of things, he loves numbers. 3, 7, 12. He's into numbers, and that's just something we get to have fun with and play with when we read Matthew, and we'll have some examples in the weeks to come. Matthew is clearly a teaching gospel. In fact, some believe that Matthew was really one of the first catechisms. Like we have Luther's catechism, and we have all these catechisms that teach the faith. A lot of scholars look at Matthew itself as a kind of catechism, written to teach the whole of Christianity to someone. You might call it also an accountant gospel because it is very meticulous. Anybody know the Myers-Briggs stuff? You know, ENFJs are very orderly and planned, set. Matthew is very much that way. He's not a just throw it up on the wall and let's see what sticks. He is methodical. He plans everything out. And again, he's got things set in different numeric sections, and we'll talk some more about that. Also, there's some strange, interesting stuff where Matthew loves to double up things. Did you know when Jesus rides on Palm Sunday, right? He rides into Jerusalem. And what does he ride on? A donkey, right. But you're absolutely wrong according to the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew says that he rode on both a donkey and the foal. He rode on 2 animals. It's literally, that's what he says. It's crazy. Interesting. Is that because he wants to show us Jesus is fulfilling a couple of different passages? We don't know. He does these interesting doublings, and it's interesting. So, but it's truly a gospel with a plan. Let's kind of do a little bit of a background then, and we'll look at kind of the structure and the order of it. When we look at the date and setting of the Gospel of Matthew, we're pretty sure that Matthew was written 70 AD or a little bit after. There's a couple phrases in the Gospel of Matthew, to this day, ... So it's like an explanation of, well, let me just go there so I can, let's see if we've got it here. Yes. Okay, so here's the thing about, so they took the money and did as they were directed, and this story is still told among the Jews to this day. Now this is a story about covering up the resurrection, that it didn't happen, and they paid the soldiers to say that his body was stolen or something. And so, but this phrase to this day is an echoing of an Old Testament phrase that usually means about a generation. So a lot of people say, well, if Jesus was crucified around 30, AD, and he was raised somewhere in that area, you throw on a generation and you wind up around 70 AD. The other reason, though, that some scholars think that that it was around 70 AD is that there seems to be talk about the fall of Jerusalem as if it's already happened, or it's for sure going to happen. And so a lot of people think, that makes sense. But in truth, we don't know the exact time, but I think that's our best guess about when it's actually written. So remember that you've got a generation before the gospel writers actually pen their gospel. Why do you think, you can just throw out some ideas, why do you think it took them so long to write everything down that Jesus did? Why? Any guesses? Yeah, Bob?
They thought Jesus was coming shortly.
Okay,
so why
right.
write it?
Excellent, Barb?
It wasn't a written culture.
Okay, right. So there wasn't that urgency because this culture knew how to preserve things verbally, orally. Bailey, a scholar who has done a lot of work in the Middle East, has shown that Middle Eastern cultures tell stories and they police each other and how they tell the story. If you tell it wrong, you get in trouble. And they do this all the time. So Jesus' words, his teachings, his actions would have been preserved in a very solid way because it was an oral culture, exactly like Barb said. Also, Bob was absolutely correct. Jesus said, I'm coming back soon. Okay, so why go to the bother? You see? So, but Jesus tarries and he delays, and so Christians start to go, oh, we better get this stuff written down. We do, however, absolutely believe that there were oral, written stuff started to get written down. That very likely our four gospel writers used some written tradition in writing their gospel as well. So here's some other things about the date and setting that comes with Matthew. We think Matthew was probably more of an urban setting. If you look at the use of the word city, just a ton of occurrences of the word city in Matthew, as opposed to in Mark, where we hear more about what? Villages. So that just made, for a lot of scholars, think, well, this may have been a more urban setting, and then maybe even middle to upper class. Why do I say that? Well, if we were to look at Matthew 10:9 here, we'd hear a little bit of the story of Jesus sending out his disciples on a missionary journey, go out and do this. And in that instructions, in Matthew, Jesus says, take no copper, silver, or gold. And in Mark, the exact passage, it just says, take no copper. No money, but it was copper coin. What's up with that? It's clearly the exact saying of Jesus. Well, a lot of people think, well, folks in Matthew's community had the gold card. They had the MasterCard and the Visa, But in Mark's community, all they had was copper. It was gold. They were poor, more on the fringes kind of community out of which this gospel and for which this gospel was first written. In Matthew, we think, well, maybe middle, upper class, and a more urban setting. There's little cues that help us think, well, that really might be true. When it comes to who wrote Matthew, you might say, I thought Matthew wrote Matthew. Well, let's talk about that. How many of you know, have ever heard anything about a guy named Eusebius? Anybody ever heard of Eusebius before? Oh, good. I can tell you about Eusebius. Eusebius is one of the first Christian historians, and he writes in the early 4th century, 325 or so in there, and he writes for Constantine. Because now Christianity has become the religion of the state of Rome, and what do you got to do? Well, you got to have a history. So Eusebius writes a very long and wonderful history of Christianity, and it's from him that we learn lots of things about many of the saints who were martyred in the decades and centuries past. But a lot of scholars say, suspect. You know, he's writing with a Christian bias. Really? Historians write with bias? I've never heard that. I didn't know that. Of course, you can never have a completely objective telling of history, and yeah, he tells the story from a Christian perspective. Well, Eusebius tells about a guy 100 or 2 years before named Papias, and Papias says that Matthew, the Gospel Matthew, or that actually doesn't say the Gospel Matthew, he says that Matthew the disciple wrote down the words of Jesus in Hebrew and Aramaic, wrote down the sayings. So Eusebius quotes a guy named Papias who said that that's what Matthew did. Eusebius doesn't say that, attribute that to the Gospel of Matthew, but church history, you can see how we said, oh, well, sure, that's perfect. That's just like Matthew, because as we're going to discover, Matthew is a very Jewish gospel. So a lot of people have said, well, that's why we can say that Matthew wrote Matthew. But in truth, as I've tried to educate you for many years now, and pastors before me, I'm sure, all of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are anonymous works. It does not say anywhere in the original manuscripts or in our oldest manuscripts, the Gospel of Matthew, or this Gospel's been written by Matthew. Those are people that the Gospels have become attributed to. Do we know for sure Matthew wrote this book? No. Does it make sense in some ways? Certainly. So, we don't know exactly who wrote it, but we get to call him Matthew, because we got to call him something. So that's where the tradition about how Matthew wrote Matthew. But more importantly than just a name, what do we get about the author or his concerns from the gospel itself? We know for sure he was a devout and educated Christian. Matthew's Greek is much more beautiful, stylish than the Gospel of Mark. There's a lot of places where, and this gets into synoptic gospel origination theory, but there's lots of places where Matthew clearly takes Mark, a saying that's in Mark, and in fact, 90% of the Gospel of Mark is in the Gospel of Matthew. 90% of everything in Mark is in Matthew. But there's places where Matthew clearly took a saying where the Greek was a little rough and messed up. He cleans it up. Now, you wouldn't know that, and I wouldn't know that, but people who know Greek can see that. Oh, wow, this guy was a little bit better writer. Or he was writing for folks who were a little more refined in their language or whatever. We're quite confident that this was a Jewish Christian. There are lots of places in all of the Gospels where it says that Jesus did this to fulfill something, but this happens over and over in the Gospel of Matthew. It's clearly, Matthew has a concern that we see Jesus as the fulfillment of the Hebrew Scriptures. Another way we kind of pretty sure that this was a Jewish Christian. Anybody know how the Gospel of Matthew starts without looking? Anybody know? What? Genealogy, exactly, Kim. And that genealogy, in Luke it comes a little bit later, but in Matthew that's what you start out with. Well, that was a very Jewish thing to do. You got to know where are you connected. And where does Matthew start his genealogy? Not with Noah. Abraham and Sarah. Because that's exactly when, God, the initial covenant began. So that's one among many other ways that we're confident that Matthew's he's a Jewish Christian. It's very possible that Matthew is a converted rabbi or scribe. this one up, and then I'll come back to the scribe part. In Matthew we hear, and it's only in Matthew we hear this, that Jesus said stuff like this: I'm sent only to the lost house of Israel. That clearly Jesus is first come to speak to the lost, the broken Israel. And that's his purpose. So another real, a very Jewish influence and theme here. Then finally, I want to say that it's, and going back to the rabbi thing, we're pretty sure that, because you can see, Matthew's very hard on the religious Jewish leaders. In the Gospel of Matthew, they're really villains. And you can kind of pick up on real tension between the synagogue and the church. Let's have some fun and let me show you what I mean by that. Let's see if I can find this search here. Well, let's just not worry about that. Let's put rabbi in here. And we'll take a look here at how rabbi is used in the Gospel of Matthew. One, we don't see it occur, can you see this up there? Till 23. And let's take a look at this passage here real quick. So, he's talking about people being hypocritical, and, you know, who love the places of honor at feasts and the best seats in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplace and being called rabbi. So Jesus is kind of, but you are not to be called rabbi, he says. For you have one teacher and you are all brothers. Interesting. So let me go back to the search here. If I find the right, I'm over here. But then we get down to 26. Judas, who calls, there's only one person in the Gospel of Matthew that ever calls Jesus rabbi. Not so if you look at, Peter said to Jesus, Rabbi, it's good for us to be here in Mark. And we can look at the same in Luke. But in Matthew, rabbi is a bad word. Who calls Jesus Matthew? Who calls Jesus? I've got a new puppy at home, so I'm probably sleeping. Who calls Jesus rabbi in Matthew? Judas comes to him and says, Rabbi. So that, and for many other reasons, we get a sense that, boy, there's this real tension in the community of Matthew between the synagogue and the church. And we know this. There's another reason why we're thinking maybe the fall of Jerusalem, because we know that by that time, at first Christians worshipped in the temple. They, you were a Jew. There were no Christians. But eventually, the church folks get kicked out of the synagogue, and the church, and this kind of separation starts to happen. So enough to say, when we think about the author, that the person who writes this gospel is a Jewish Christian, very educated, very focused on a plan, catechetical teaching emphasis, and very Jewish in his orientation. So when we think of an overview now of the Gospel of Matthew, there are three sections to Matthew that are marked by a phrase. Again, these biblical manuscripts didn't have verses, they didn't have chapters, they didn't even have punctuation. Okay? All consonants, no vowels, because you had to conserve space on the manuscript. So all of the verses and the chapters, all of that stuff that Bible folks, the church has put in so we could find stuff later. But so how did they do it? Well, they showed organization by certain sayings and phrases, and that phrase is in Mark and Matthew. At that time, Jesus began to. And so Matthew really carries over Mark's basic chronology. 1:1 to 4:7, who is Jesus? And then we hear this phrase, at that time Jesus began to. And then we launch into all kinds of teaching in the Gospel of Matthew. And so that's the ministry or the story of Jesus to the lost house of Israel. So all his works, all his teachings are clearly about that. And they mainly happen up in Galilee. And I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. And then at 1620, we hear that same phrase again. At that time, Jesus began to what? Head to Jerusalem. And now everything changes. And now it's about the journey to Jerusalem and Jesus' passion and resurrection. So we start up in the Sea of Galilee, beautiful lake, which reminds me a little bit of Lake Tahoe. I've been to Lake Tahoe. I don't know which one's big. I think Tahoe's probably bigger, but I don't know. But you have that sense about it. A beautiful lake at times, but it's big enough that a storm could come in, and you know, the waves, the wind hitting the water creates big waves. You could perish out on that sea. And then we end up in Jerusalem at the temple. And this is a picture of what the temple would have looked like in Jesus' time. So that's kind of the flow. Now let me give you some info on the order, and then I'm going to get you to work. There are actually, and now this is more unique to Matthew, 5 sections. Even though I've given you the flow of the Gospel of Matthew, there are 5 sections of the Gospel of Matthew. You say, how is that? Well, another phrase is used. When Jesus had finished these sayings, that happens 5 times. Now, here's another reason why we think Matthew is a Jewish Gospel. What significance is there of the number 5? Pentateuch. And what is that, Barb? First 5 books of the Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. The Pentateuch. This is the teaching. This is the Torah to every Jew. There are 5 books. Well, there are 5 times that Matthew says when Jesus had finished these sayings. And then boom, we got another section. And then, so that happens 5 different times. The new community is called to practice a higher righteousness. And we've got the Sermon on the Mount. Then we hear in 11:1, when Jesus finished these sayings, we've got a section where the new community in its mission encounters hostility. Then the new community brings forth things new and old in its teaching. And then the new community practices forgiveness and reconciliation in chapter 18. And then the new community readies itself for the coming of the Son of Man. And so we can see these 5 sections that are delineated by this phrase after Jesus finished these sayings. I want to give you a few things that are unique to Matthew, that only come from Matthew, and then you are going to work with a parable that only is found in Matthew. And I want you to, I don't have any agenda here, I'm going to have you read the parable and say, what's the main focus? And then I'm going to have you each table share that, and I want to see if we can see, is there any common theme here? Why are these parables unique to Matthew? Why did Matthew want to make sure we know about them? But before we do that, let's just take a look at we're going to look at Mark Allen Powell's book. These are some things, I just want to run through it, that you may not know are unique to Jesus. They'll be very familiar to you. So the genealogy from Abraham is unique, although Luke has one that's from Noah, or Adam, excuse me. And then, so the birth of Jesus that focused on Joseph, everything we know about Joseph comes from Matthew. Why would Matthew be concerned about Joseph? Because Matthew, a very Jewish gospel, wants us to know that Jesus is the King of David. And that's the Joseph connection. The Magi. We didn't have the Gospel of Matthew, we wouldn't know about the Magi. Stuff about the fulfilling of the law, very important, is only in Matthew. Why would you get the Jewish sense about things? The antitheses, Jesus saying, you've heard it said, but I say to you. So he's taking authority, interesting there. Stuff about piety, pearls before swine, the mission to Israel, we already talked about that. Lots of things. We can see the parables. Peter tries to walk on the water, only in the Gospel of Matthew. That's where we get that story. And also, well, maybe he'll talk about that a little bit later, but let me just say there's a lot of stuff on Peter in Matthew. And when I said about the urban setting, a lot of scholars believe that would be Antioch, most likely, which was a huge city in early Christianity and one where Peter lived. The stuff about on this rock, I will found my church, that the Catholic Church holds up for the concept of the Pope and the cardinals, that's only in Matthew. in Mark, in Jesus, when Peter's confronted by Jesus, Peter says, "No, I'm not going to let you go to the cross." And Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." That's it. But in Matthew, it goes on, and Peter says, he's pictured much better than in Mark. Let's say it that way. And then Jesus says, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter says in Mark, "Well, you're the Christ, the Son of God." That's it. But then in Matthew, goes on, and Jesus says, "On you, Peter, I'll found my church." So we get a lot more of Peter in the Gospel of Matthew. So okay, keep going here. Let's see. The denunciation of the Pharisees there, that's big. That shows that kind of anti-synagogue, that kind of tension that's going on. Pilate washes his hands. That's from the Gospel of Matthew. Let's see. And then we get this interesting stuff. Did you know that when Jesus was raised from the dead, some saints, some people who had died were also raised up? According to the Gospel of Matthew, that's what happened. And they even appeared to people in Jerusalem. That's not in the other Gospels. The whole thing about the guard at the tomb, that's from Matthew. And of course, finally, the Great Commission. Go baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey all I've commanded you. And what's the last part? And lo, I will be with you always, to the end of the age. That's all the Gospel of Matthew. So some fun stuff that's very unique to Matthew. But now, I want to put you to work. You've been listening long enough. I'd like you to read that passage. And then I want you you don't have to kill yourself. This is a parable. So do what you can with it. Some of you have the sheep and the goats thing that's kind of a parable, kind of a story. But just say, what's the main concern of this parable? Okay? What's the main concern of this parable? Sometimes parables are hard. So I don't know what the main concern is. But give it your best shot. So read that at your table. If you're not sitting at a table and you want to find a table, that's great. So if you want to team up over here, perfect. I got my mic, is that gonna work, John? You good? Okay. Okay, so if I got my mic runners up. So what I want to hear from you, we don't have time to read the whole parable, obviously. So if you can just say, well, we had the parable of, as best you can, or the parables of, there's a couple that had more than one. And what did your table come up with that's the main concern of that parable? And this is not a right or wrong answer. These are parables, right? They're designed to get you scratching your head and wrestling and struggling. So who wants to start? Brett's over there by that table. Oh, Don's ready to go. We'll come on up here and then we'll give you up some more time. Okay.
We don't have deep thoughts. Our parable is about sowing weeds with wheat. And the parable basically says that don't sort them out now, wait until they all grow, and then separate the wheat from the weeds. Burn the weeds and harvest the wheat.
Yeah.
And it also indicates that in verse 30, I'm sorry, we're Matthew 13:24.
Yeah.
Then in Matthew 37, he explains the parable of the weeds.
Right.
So he basically sets out, okay, here's what I meant.
Right. So what do you think's the concern? Like,
you want to be a wheat. You don't want to be a weed.
Okay, good, excellent, perfect. That's great. No, that's it all. I know it's simple, but so are you weeds or wheat?
Well, the one
is a big question. Good.
Right.
And don't judge. Let God do it at the end. Right. Go. Keep going. Keep going.
The one wrench I had with this that came up as we were talking about something else, just idea popped in my head. So we talked a little bit about, are you a wheat or weed?
Yeah.
If the devil is sowing weeds and we let him grow, in this parable, there's no space for humanity.
Yeah.
In the fact that you're either a wheat or you're a weed.
Yeah. It's really black and white, isn't it?
Right. And so you start out that way.
Yeah.
Is the problem. It doesn't allow for salvation in this particular parable. Yeah. Okay, that's as far as I go with that.
No monkey wrenches allowed here. No, absolutely. No, that's a great question. Excellent. Let's keep moving. Just give me your main concern of that particular passage. That was excellent. Thank you very much. Good. I'm going to, believe it or not, try and tie all this together.
We have the parable of the vineyard owner who hired people to do some work, and then he found some more people and hired them and so forth and so on.
Yeah.
So the last hour he hired them, and he paid them all equally at the end. And the first thing that occurred to me was, I've been going to church all my life, and this other guy just joined last week.
Yeah,
That's not fair that he's got the same reward that I'm
that's right.
anticipating. We had a note in one of the scriptures here. The subject is the reward of willingness to serve, whether one comes early or late. Christ is not teaching economics.
Okay. Oh, this doesn't apply to economics. Well, that's probably true. Okay, good. So a concern, what about the new person? I've been around, how do we, it's not this fairness issue. Good. All right, good. Over here.
No, I'm not commenting on him.
No, go on to yours. That's right. We got to move, so yeah.
We
Okay.
had 25:1-13, the parable of bridesmaids.
Yeah.
And they were at the wedding, and the wise brought the oil and the unwise did not. The bridegroom was late in arriving, and so they wanted to borrow oil from the bridesmaids who brought the oil, and they wouldn't give it to him. And the thing of it is, it's preparation. This is the main thing here, is preparation. But I also just noticed in there that we were talking about the foolishness of the 5 women who did not prepare. But they expected the bridegroom to come in the daytime, so they wouldn't need the light.
Right.
They wouldn't need the oil. So, were they foolish or
Practical.
what? Yeah, or practical, yeah. But at the end, it said when he came, he did not know them.
Okay. Yeah. So are you getting, did anybody have gnashing of teeth and it's kind of harsh stuff here sometimes. Yeah. Good. Excellent. So being ready. Okay, good. Where are we at? Okay, please, let's go over here.
We also have the parable of the vineyards, and we also read that it's unjust, where it's, the analogy, if you're dying in bed, you go to see Christ, or somebody who at 18 works all his life to Christ. It's unfair. The guys who worked and standing around the market couldn't go into the vineyard earlier.
Right.
So I think the solution to this, stay home playing the video games, and go when you get...
Just go in at the last minute.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that the point? Okay, good. That's good for more of that. Please. Yep. Barb?
So we had a whole bunch.
Yeah, you had a bunch of little ones, right?
Yeah. We had the explanation of the wheat and the weeds, and there was gnashing of teeth in there.
Yes.
If you're
Yeah.
evil, you get tossed into the flames, and
Yeah.
it's like gnashing of teeth.
Yeah.
And then we had, the pearl of great price. You sell everything you have because you know the value of this.
Yeah.
Same with the treasure that you find in the field. You know the value of it.
Yes.
When you go fishing, the nets pull in good and bad. You keep the good and you throw out the bad. Real
Okay.
black and white
So
stuff.
again, black and white, there's the good and the not so good. And we go, as Lutherans, we go, wait, I thought we were sainted sinners here, man. It's great tension. Excellent job. How about over here? Or did we get everybody here? No. You guys, anybody want to throw on here?
We had the parable of Last Judgment,
Aha.
where he's separating the good on his right and the bad on his left.
Oh, more of the good and bad.
And it boils down to serving others.
Okay.
And it fit
It
right
is-
in with your sermon
Yeah.
this
So
morning.
inasmuch you've done it to the least of these,
Yep.
you've done it to me. Okay? Good. Excellent. So let's keep going. How about you guys?
Parable of the bridesmaids.
Same? Anything different to add? No? Okay. Good. How about right here?
Yeah, we had 2 sons told to go work in the vineyard. One of them said, okay, and didn't. The other one said, no, and then did. So which one's better? And then the last part of it talks about tax collectors, prostitutes going into heaven before the people that Jesus was talking to. You had the point of, hey, maybe this is them, the religious leaders at the time not buying into the concept of Christ.
Right, right. Okay, good. So, do you go or not? He's saying, talking is cheap, right? The one who actually said that he wasn't going to go, but then did go, is the good one, right? Well, then let's go back to this one over here. You know, inasmuch you've done it to the least of these. You know, so talk's cheap. Action, very good. Okay, back here, I think we got one more table, or two, yeah?
Yeah, so we had the unforgiving servant. And the servant owes the master an unbelievable amount of money, and he begs for forgiveness, and the master basically negates the debt. And then the servant comes up from there and runs into a man who owes him a very small amount of money and is totally unforgiving and throws him in the debtor's prison. So, kind of, I guess the two sort of points of it are, you know, one, we sort of fail to see our own hypocrisy, and that two, you know, forgiveness for other people, we should weigh that in terms of what we've been forgiven, that it's a much smaller debt than what we owe God. So
nice, thank you. So you mentioned a word, hypocrisy. Big important word to the writer of the Gospel of Matthew. And in fact, although Matthew's very critical of religious leaders in his day, Bob Smith in his commentary makes the point, he thinks Matthew is criticizing the Christian leaders of his day, who are already drunk with power and, you know, are not doing what they're supposed to do. Just as something to think about. Okay, so now who can tie all this together for us? Who'd like to? Wow! No, I thought I'd give you a shot at it first. Come on. Please, Dennis. I see Dennis is going to take this on right here, John. Yeah.
Okay, it's just like with my kids. Life's not fair.
Life's not fair. Now remember, these are unique parables. Thank you. These are unique parables. Here's something really old. Yes, please. Here, add on. Yeah. Yep.
Well, it seems like too in all of these, we can choose to be ready or not.
Okay, so readiness.
Yeah.
Okay, let's bring these two together here. And then, well, Bill, you go, and then I'll get some more. Yeah.
2 points. One, the person that's been faithful all their life compared to the ones that just now. I think you have to look at the advantages that the person that's been faithful all their life and what that has done to enhance their life.
That's right.
So you can say they've been much better off.
Absolutely.
The other thing in the combination of the treasure in the field and the pearl versus the other, maybe it's that treasure, which is Christ's salvation for us, is what makes it possible in the other parables to actually become righteous.
Yeah. No, really nice. I've got to pick up on that. So let's do these three comments right here. Dennis said it's not fair. And we talked about, hey, be ready. Think 70 AD. You're a Christian community. You're now apart from the synagogue. You are the minority. You are a tiny little group. What's the concern? Matt, guess here's a fun little tidbit. The only place that the word ecclesia, church, occurs in all four Gospels is in Matthew. Church never exists because the church doesn't exist yet. But in Matthew 18, we hear a lot of stuff about the church. Matthew has a concern about relationships within church. Let's bring in the forgiveness issue. Do we forgive each other? And it's pretty harsh stuff. If you don't forgive, it's pretty law. And then, why don't we forgive sometimes? Because if you're focused on fairness, it's going to be hard. Okay? So you see the connection there? But then also, the other thing that's clearly a threat and a problem, Jesus hasn't come back yet. I guess maybe we'll just go back to the synagogue. Maybe Jesus wasn't the one. So, we have a parable and some other parables that say, no, there's a delay. Hang in there. Believe. So you see how those come together. And then also with this pearl of great price and this kind of action, some of these parables of action and get going and do this, I think clearly, and I've got to say this to you, as we hear from Matthew, remember that law gospel Lutheran thing that we talk about? The law convicts us of our sin, and then the gospel, of course, forgives us our sin. That's a real too simple summary. But there's a lot of law in the Gospel of Matthew, preached by Jesus. Again, one biblical scholar, pastor I really appreciate, Ron Hoyam, says, and he probably got it from somebody else, Jesus preaches the law and is the gospel. Bill, it gets a little bit to what you were talking about. There's a lot of law in Matthew. When you read this, you're going to say, where's the grace, man? There's gnashing of teeth. There's right and wrong, good and bad, black and white. Matthew, I believe, is very concerned with the problem that happened from the Apostle Paul's preaching. Now remember, Paul preaches before Matthew writes. Paul's in the 50s. What was Paul's biggest problem? And we see it in Corinth. If you're saved by grace through faith, come on! I love to sin and God loves to forgive it, so let's do it, that's great. People still criticize the Lutheran Church for that. They still criticize Paul for that. Matthew is very concerned about that and writes in such a way to say, if you think you can kick your feet up on the couch, you've got another thing coming. And we get Jesus' call to discipleship, man. It's tough. You see how that's all in there in all of those passages for you? Any other ways that you found another common theme in those unique parables of the Gospel of Matthew that we looked at? Anybody else? Bill, chime in.
Just to take up for Paul.
Yeah, it's on. It'll come on.
Just to take up for Paul a little bit.
Yeah.
In all of his letters, it's rife with what your behavior should be.
Absolutely.
Because even though you're saved, then that's the beginning of your salvation and working out your salvation.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Bill. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of Paul to believe that he taught that. But we see clearly that Christians thought they heard him say that. And in Corinth, we see this in particular. So that's a fun exercise. We've just scratched the surface on the beauty and the excitement of the Gospel of Matthew. So we've done some of this, and by doing that, I think we've got to talk about some unique concerns of Matthew. We're going to have to wrestle with this situation that Don, you talked about, boy, this black and whiteness, because what I like to do, by the way, with that parable as a Lutheran, I like to say, yeah, see, I've got weed and wheat both in me. I'm a sainted sinner. I'm both and, but that's not what the parable says. And the fact the parable says at the end then, but I think for Matthew what it is stop judging one another. Okay, I wanted to get back to that. Going back to Peter's thing, forgive what's fair. Matthew is a concern for the church getting along in community. And if you're looking around, I bet you that person's a weed. And that person, if you start doing that, you've got trouble. And Matthew says, don't do that. That's God's thing. God will take care of it in the end, right? And if you start trying to do that, what's going to happen? You're going to pull up the wheat too. You're going to start damaging everybody else. So you can see how even that parable fits with the concept, the concern around community. I want to finish up. I've got 1 minute. I want to finish up with a really cool key text, and we'll let this launch us into next week. In Matthew 13:22, let me get to there. Let's see here. Oh, maybe it's here. Yeah, no, well, it doesn't matter. Let's go there. Matthew 13:22. So this is that same parable of, get rid of my intern. Oh, what's happening here? Get rid of the interlinear. Okay, so this is that parable where, you throw seeds and some fall on the path and some fall on the rocky ground and all this stuff. Well, I want to do a little comparing. Wow, I really messed up my whole thing here. There, that's what I want. Let's do a little comparing here. Find it. Sorry, I'll get it. There. So this is a comparison. I don't know why this keeps doing this, and it's bothering me. Anyway, so this is a comparison of Mark, Luke, and Matthew on this parable. And so let me just go down and show you some things. What do you notice right here? You'll notice in Matthew and Mark, and these are the ones along the path where the word is sown, and when they hear, Satan comes in immediately and takes away the word that was sown in them. So Satan comes in and messes it up. And then in Luke, the ones along the path are those who have heard. Then the devil comes and takes away the word. So here's a place where Luke pretty much duplicates Mark exactly. Let's go to Mark. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom, so now we've got this focus on the kingdom, and that'll be another thing we'll work on. And what?
Does not understand.
Does not understand. Very interesting. We'll pick this up next week. Give you a little something to come back for. In Matthew, the key is understanding what's going on in Jesus. So that's the problem. And in fact, now let's go on. As for what's sown on the good ground, let's get all the way down here. Thorns. Okay, here we go. As for what is sown on the good soil, this is the one who hears the word and I told you Matthew's a teaching gospel. What is it in Mark? It's not understand. And in Luke, it's for the good soil. Let's see. Hear the word, hold it fast and honest and good heart, and bear fruit. In Mark, it's the one who accepts the word. In Matthew, it's the one who understands. So we're going to be letting Matthew help us with what it means to understand the gospel. All right. Sorry, my computer went a little ride there. Patty, please.
You asked us to read Esther and said you would tie us in
For Advent. I'm doing that in church.
Okay. Oh, well.
Yes. Chuck asked me the same thing. Yeah, the Esther thing was coming in church. Sorry. I could probably tie Esther into this song. Go in peace, serve the Lord.
Thank you.